The colony ship Undying Hope was not built for war. It was built for families. Its wide corridors were made for children to run through. Its large observation decks were made for people to sit and watch the stars with their loved ones. Its medical bays were stocked with birth supplies and vaccines, not wound treatments and blood replacement packs. The Undying Hope was a ship full of soft things, blankets, toys, seeds for new gardens, and the quiet dreams of 4,000 Cathari who only wanted to start a new life somewhere peaceful. That dream was ending now. Ambassador Sailyuru stood on the bridge and watched the Vreeth raiders close in on his ship through the main display. His thin fingers gripped the edge of the control panel. His bioluminescent skin, usually a calm and steady blue, was flickering in broken, fearful patterns, the way Cathari skin always did when the body could not hide what the mind was feeling. There were 14 Vreeth ships on the display, then 16, then 19. More kept arriving, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in small groups, like wolves circling a wounded animal that had nowhere to run. Each Vreeth vessel was long and dark, and covered in thick armor plating that looked like it had been designed by something that enjoyed the idea of crushing other things. Their hull markings were painted in deep red, the color the Vreeth used to show how many kills they had recorded. These ships had a lot of red on them. "Ambassador," said his first officer Tinao from the communication station. Her voice was very quiet. "They are hailing us." "Put it through," Sailyuru said. The voice that came over the channel was deep and slow, and full of a kind of lazy confidence that was worse than anger. It was the voice of something that did not need to hurry, because it already knew how the situation would end. "Cathari vessel," the Vreeth commander said. "You are carrying registered colony goods, medical supplies, and approximately 4,000 civilian passengers. We will take the goods and the supplies. Whether your passengers survive depends on how quickly you open your cargo bays. You have 5 minutes." The channel clicked off. No negotiation, no demands for money, not even the pretense of a reason, just a countdown and a choice between two different kinds of loss. Sailyuru turned to his crew. They were all looking at him. Some of the younger crew members had their hands pressed flat on their consoles, a Cathari gesture of fear that children used when they did not want others to see them shaking. "Our engines?" he asked. 30%, said the engineering officer. "We took damage from the first pass. We cannot run." "Weapons?" "We have point defense systems. Against 19 Vreeth warships, they would last approximately 4 minutes. Defense fields?" "Already failing." Sailyuru closed his eyes for a moment. He was an ambassador. He had spent 30 years of his life learning how to solve problems with words. He had sat across tables from difficult people and worked through impossible disagreements with patience and careful language. He had always believed that talking was the answer to almost everything. There was no one to talk to right now. He opened his eyes. "Open every broadcast frequency we have," he said. "Every single one. Wideband, long range, full power. I want our signal reaching as far as it can go." Tinao looked up. "Ambassador, the nearest Cathari patrol is 11 hours away. The Galactic Cooperative's nearest station is." "I know," Sailyuru said. "Open every frequency anyway." She did. Sailyuru sat down in the command chair. It felt strange, sitting down at a moment like this. But his legs were not steady. He pulled the broadcast controls toward him and began speaking clearly and slowly into the open signal. "This is Ambassador Sailyuru aboard the Cathari colony vessel Undying Hope. We are under attack by Vreeth raiders in Sector 77 Alpha of the Outer Verge. We have 4,000 civilian passengers aboard, including children. Our engines and defense systems are critically damaged. We are unable to run and unable to fight. We are broadcasting on all available frequencies and requesting immediate emergency assistance from any vessel within range." He paused. Then he added the one thing that felt almost foolish to say out loud. Any vessel, any species. We are asking anyone who can hear this to please help us. He sent the message out on every frequency the ship had, including a set of newer emergency channels that had been added to the Galactic Cooperative's communication guidelines recently. Most ships hadn't bothered to update their receivers to include those channels. They were considered unnecessary, overly optimistic, a strange idea pushed forward by a species called humanity, who apparently believed that emergency signals should be able to reach as many receivers as possible. Most of the galaxy had shrugged at the idea. The Vreeth commander hailed again at the 4-minute mark. "Cathari vessel, you have 1 minute. Open your cargo bays." Sayuluru did not respond. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and watched the display and breathed slowly, because breathing slowly was the only thing he could control right now. At the bridge station behind him, T-Now made a small sound. Not a word, just a sound the kind a person made when something unexpected appeared on a screen. "Ambassador," she said slowly, "we have a response." Sayuluru turned. "From who?" It came in on one of the new frequencies, the human emergency band. T-Now stared at her display. "It is not a voice message. It is a transponder signature, automated response. It came back in." She checked the timestamp. 6 minutes and 14 seconds after our broadcast. Sayuluru crossed the bridge and looked at the display himself. He did not recognize the transponder format. He did not know the ship designation system, but the translation software rendered the text clearly enough. HSV Unconquered Sun, Terran Rapid Response Division, acknowledged, ETA, 11 minutes. 11 minutes. Sayuluru read it twice. He did not know how a ship could be 11 minutes away in this part of the outer verge. Nobody had ships stationed out here. It was too far from everything, too empty, too far from any trade route worth protecting. On the Vreeth flagship, which was called the Iron Dominion, Warlord Drexkoth received the same transponder signal through his long-range sensors and laughed. Not loudly, just a short, dismissive sound. He had his sensor officer pull up the galactic species database and look up humanity. The entry was not impressive. Humanity was listed as a Class 3 developing species, spacefaring for less than 80 years. No confirmed large-scale fleet engagements on record. Homeworld described as a high-gravity, high-radiation, biologically dangerous environment. Species noted as physically anomalous in certain respects, but with no combat history that warranted any tactical concern. "Humans," Drexkoth said. "We are being threatened by humans." His bridge crew found this funny. One of his officers pointed out that the human ship was probably a small patrol vessel, maybe 1 or 2 lightly armed craft sent to look important. Another suggested they destroy it quickly before it could report back, to avoid paperwork with the Galactic Cooperative. Drexkoth agreed. He would finish with the Cathari ship first, then deal with the humans when they arrived. It would not take long. He went back to watching the countdown. Back on the Undying Hope, Sayuluru returned to the command chair. He had no idea what was coming. He had never met a human. He knew almost nothing about them except that they had apparently thought it was important to make sure emergency signals could reach as many people as possible. He supposed that said something about them. He did not know what it said. He did not know if 11 minutes would matter. He did not know if one ship, or however many were coming, would make any difference against 19 Vreeth raiders. But for the first time since the attack began, his skin stopped flickering. It stayed a quiet, steady blue. He folded his hands in his lap again and waited, and outside the Undying Hope, the stars were cold and still, and 11 minutes felt like forever and no time at all. The first thing Warlord Drexkoth noticed was that his long-range sensors were struggling to track the incoming ships properly. That was strange. His sensor array was military-grade, one of the best the Vreeth Dominion produced. It could track a single escape pod through an asteroid field at 600,000 kilometers. It should have had no trouble locating 17 small vessels in open space. But the human ships were running dark, no navigation lights, no standard transponder pings, no heat signatures beyond what their engines were producing, which suggested their hulls were insulated in a way that absorbed and distributed heat instead of radiating it. They were not invisible, but they were close to it in a way that felt deliberate and practiced and slightly uncomfortable. Drexkoth leaned forward in his command throne and studied the display. 17 contacts. The ships were smaller than he expected, compact, low profile, with none of the decorative hull structures that most spacefaring species added to their vessels over time. Vreeth warships had high-raised command spires. Cathari ships had wide, rounded observation decks. Even the Galactic Cooperative's patrol vessels had large visible docking arms and communication arrays that gave them an open, almost friendly shape. The human ships looked like weapons, just weapons, long and flat and dense, with no wasted space anywhere on the hull, like someone had looked at everything that wasn't essential and removed it. They were the color of deep space, not painted, but actually surfaced in something that reflected almost no light at all. Drexkoth called his sensor officer over. "What is their approach vector?" The sensor officer studied his instruments for a long moment. Then he looked up with an expression that Drexkoth had never seen on one of his officers before. "Warlord," the officer said carefully, "they are approaching through the Marin dwarf star's gravity field." Drexkoth stared at him. "Through it." "Through it. They have positioned themselves to use the gravity field as a slingshot. They will exit the field at approximately 0.4% of light speed and decelerate directly into our position." The sensor officer paused. "Our own pilots assessed that approach vector when we entered this sector. It was classified as non-viable. The structural stress on any vessel attempting it at that speed would be what? Catastrophic for most ships." Drexkoth looked back at the display. The human ships were still accelerating, going deeper into the gravity field, not away from it, committing to the approach fully, not slowing down, not hesitating. He pulled up the galactic database entry on humanity again and reread it. Class 3 developing species, biologically anomalous, high gravity homeworld. He thought about what high gravity meant for a species over thousands of years of evolution. Heavier bones, denser muscle, a body built to handle forces that would crush or injure other species. He thought about what that kind of body might do inside a ship that was enduring forces that would be catastrophic for most vessels. He closed the database. "All ships," he said to his fleet, "prepare for contact." For the first time in the engagement, his voice did not have that lazy, confident quality in it. The waiting took 4 minutes. On the Undying Hope, Sailuru and his crew watched their display in silence. The Vreeth ships had stopped moving toward them. They were repositioning, spreading out, turning to face the direction the human signal had come from. That alone told Sailuru something. The Vreeth were not ignoring the incoming ships anymore. Then the Marin dwarf star's gravity field did what gravity fields do, and it released what it had been given. 17 human ships came out of the slingshot burn like something fired from a gun. They moved so fast that the light from their engine exhausts arrived a fraction of a second after the ships themselves, creating a brief visual effect where they appeared to be moving ahead of their own fire. The deceleration burn they ignited to slow down was enormous. A long wall of superheated plasma that flooded the entire sector with white light and hard radiation, and a wave of engine exhaust that Sailuru's crew had to filter through 3 layers of sensor protection just to look at directly. When the light faded, 17 dark ships sat in a line between the Undying Hope and the Vreeth fleet. Their hulls were glowing faintly red from the heat of the maneuver. Some of them had visible scoring along the forward sections, damage from the stress of the approach. They had taken damage getting here. They didn't seem to care. The lead ship, the unconquered sun, was slightly larger than the others. It had no decoration on it at all except for a designation number along the side and a small symbol near the bow, a circle with a single horizontal line through it, simple and clean. Its engines were still running hot, venting excess heat from the deceleration burn in long, slow pulses that lit up the space around it in deep orange. It broadcast on an open channel. Vreeth Fleet. The voice was a woman's voice, lower than most Cathari voices, with a flatness to it that made it hard to read as frightened or excited. It was just steady, very steady. This is Admiral Yeva Marchetti of the Terran Rapid Response Division. You have conducted an unprovoked military attack on a civilian vessel in distress. Under Galactic Cooperative Resolution 7 and the Outer Verge Emergency Statutes, you are required to stand down immediately and withdraw from this sector. You have 60 seconds to begin your withdrawal before this situation becomes a designated combat operation. Silence for 3 seconds. Then Drexkoth responded. He could not help it. He had 42 ships. She had 17. His ships were larger. Her ships were damaged from their own approach. The math was obvious to him, and he assumed it was obvious to her as well, which made her ultimatum feel like either great courage or great stupidity, and he was not yet sure which. 60 seconds, he said. Little human, you have 17 ships, we have 42. Your vessels are already damaged from whatever reckless approach you just made. You have no support in this sector and no reinforcements within hours. I respect your bravery. I do not respect your math. Stand down and leave this space, and we will allow your fleet to depart without. 53 seconds, Marchetti said. Drexkoth stopped speaking. He waited for her to continue, to explain herself, to negotiate or threaten more clearly or say something that gave him a framework for responding. She said nothing else. The channel stayed open. He could hear, faintly, the ambient sounds of her bridge, a low hum of machinery, the occasional quiet exchange between crew members in a language his translator couldn't fully process, something that might have been someone laughing softly at a station near the back. Laughing. 41 seconds, Marchetti said. Drexkoth turned to his tactical officer. She is bluffing, he said, but he said it more quietly than he intended to. His tactical officer looked at the sensor display. Warlord, their weapons systems are already online, all 17 vessels. They came out of that burn with weapons hot. A pause. They never powered them up during the approach. They were already on. 30 seconds, said Admiral Marchetti. On the bridge of the Undying Hope, Tinal turned to Sailuru. She is really counting down, she whispered. Yes, Sailuru said. Do you think she will actually? 15 seconds, said Marchetti. Yes, Sailuru said, I think she will. He was watching the Vreeth fleet on the display. Some of the outer ships were shifting their positions slightly, small adjustments, the kind a pilot made when they were nervous and didn't know they were doing it. The Vreeth did not withdraw. Time, said Admiral Marchetti. And the dark ships opened fire. The battle did not look like what Sailuru expected a battle to look like. He had seen combat footage before, old Cathari archive recordings from the border skirmishes 100 years ago, and Galactic Cooperative documentary footage of the Vreeth's campaign through the Selin Corridor 2 decades back. In those recordings, battles looked organized. Two fleets faced each other from a distance. They fired long-range weapons. Ships took damage and retreated or were destroyed. It was terrible, but it followed a logic that made sense. Distance was safety. Range was power. The fleet that could hit hardest from the farthest away usually won. The humans did not fight that way. The moment Admiral Marchetti said time, and the Terran ships opened fire, they also moved forward. Not to a better firing position, not to a flanking angle. Forward, directly toward the Vreeth fleet, closing distance at a speed that Sailuru's sensor officer confirmed was being done on purpose, not because of momentum from their earlier approach. They are closing range, Tinal said. with a larger fleet. Sayuluru did not answer because he did not have an answer. The Vreeth reacted the way any logical fleet would. They spread out to use their size advantage, firing from multiple angles to prevent the human ships from focusing their shields in one direction. It was a sound strategy. Against most opponents, it would have worked well. The human ships split their formation. Half of them pulled upward relative to the orbital plane, half went below, and they curved back in from two directions at once, moving so fast between shots that the Vreeth gunners had to keep adjusting their targeting. One human ship took a direct hit from a Vreeth heavy cannon and Sayuluru flinched, expecting it to split apart or fall back. It did not fall back. It vented atmosphere from a section of its upper hull, which meant the hit had punched through something. But the ship kept moving, kept firing. Its engine output did not drop. Sayuluru watched it take a second hit on its forward section, and still it did not stop, and something cold moved through him that he could not name, because he was realizing that these ships had been built by a species that expected to get hit and kept going anyway. 2 Vreeth cruisers were destroyed in the first 6 minutes. A third had its engine section disabled and drifted sideways out of the formation. The Vreeth fleet was large and its ships were strong, but the human ships were moving in a way that made it very hard to get a clean shot at them, always curving, always accelerating into the gaps in the Vreeth line rather than away from them. But none of that was the strangest part. At the 12-minute mark, Tinal made another one of her small sounds, that quiet, surprised noise she made when something appeared on her sensors that she didn't expect. Sayuluru was at her station in 3 steps. "What is it?" he asked. She pointed at the display. Her finger was trembling slightly. "One of their soldiers has left the ship." Sayuluru looked at the display. His sensor suite wasn't designed for tracking individual life signs in a combat zone, but the human ships were close enough now that he could pick up suited forms moving outside the hulls on the magnetic contact sensors. Most of them were damage control teams, figures crawling along the outside of their own ships, sealing breaches and replacing burned-out plating in the middle of an active battle, which was alarming enough on its own. But one figure was not on a human ship. One figure was moving away from the human fleet, alone, with a small thruster pack and what looked like a tool kit attached to its suit, moving across open space in hard vacuum toward a Vreeth cruiser. One human soldier, one Vreeth cruiser. "Is that?" Sayuluru started. "A solo boarding action," Tinal said. Her voice had gone very flat and quiet, the way it did when she was processing something that didn't fit into any category she had. "I believe that human is attempting a solo boarding action against a cruiser." "Alone. Alone." They watched. The figure reached the Vreeth cruiser's hull moving fast, much faster than safety protocols for EVA work would normally allow. It attached to the hull, moved along the surface to what appeared to be a secondary airlock on the ventral side, and then spent about 40 seconds cutting through the lock with a tool that Sayuluru's sensors could not properly identify. The tool generated a lot of heat. The lock opened. The human went inside. For 7 minutes, nothing was visible from outside. The cruiser kept firing. Then, at the 7-minute mark, the cruiser stopped firing. Then its engines went to minimal output. Then, on the emergency frequency, a human voice transmitted a short code that Sayuluru's translator rendered as secured. The Vreeth cruiser had been captured by one person. Sayuluru stood very still for a moment. He was an ambassador. He was very good at reading situations and adjusting to them quickly. He had dealt with crises in diplomatic chambers and trade negotiations and border disputes. He had thought of himself as someone who had seen many difficult things and remained calm. He was having trouble remaining calm right now. The battle had been going for 22 minutes. 9 Vreeth ships were destroyed. The captured cruiser made 10. The Vreeth fleet was still larger, but it was no longer behaving like a larger fleet. It was contracting, pulling ships closer together, which was a defensive formation, not an attacking one. The humans read this immediately and pushed harder, moving into the space the Vreeth were vacating, which forced the Vreeth to contract further. It was like watching a large animal realize that the smaller animal it had cornered was not actually afraid of it. At the 30-minute mark, the Vreeth began to run. It started with 2 of the outer ships. They simply turned and accelerated away, abandoning their formation. Then 3 more followed. Then the retreat became general, the whole Vreeth fleet breaking apart and fleeing in different directions, each ship broadcasting its own emergency signal as it went, which Sailuru found darkly meaningful. The hunters were calling for help. The humans pursued. Every human ship turned and followed. Sailuru watched the pursuit on his display for 12 full minutes, and then Admiral Marchetti broadcast a short command on the fleet channel, and every human ship stopped. Not because they had caught everyone they were going to catch. Not because they were damaged beyond pursuit. They stopped because Marchetti told them to. 14 Vreeth ships had been disabled or captured. 9 had been destroyed. 19 had fled. Not one had surrendered on its own terms. The human fleet held its position. Their hulls were still glowing hot in several places. Damage was visible on at least 6 ships, but they held the space around the Undying Hope like they owned it, which at that moment Sailuru supposed they did. Admiral Marchetti opened a channel to the Undying Hope. Her voice was the same as it had been before the battle, steady, flat, not particularly excited. "Ambassador Sailuru," she said, "this is Admiral Marchetti. The immediate threat has been neutralized. We are sending medical shuttles and a tow team to your ship now. Please have your crew open docking bay 2 and prepare to receive personnel. Is anyone aboard critically injured?" Sailuru realized his hands were gripping the edge of his console again. He let go. He straightened up. He breathed. "Yes," he said into the channel. "Yes, we have wounded. We will open the bay." He paused. "Admiral Marchetti, are your people all right?" A small silence. Then, "Lost 2 crew on the Harlow, 3 more wounded across the fleet. We've had worse." She said it simply. Not bravely, not sadly. Just simply, like it was a number to note down and move on from. Sailuru closed his eyes for a moment. "I am sorry," he said. "Thank you, Ambassador," she said. "Open Bay 2, we'll be there in 5 minutes." Outside the Undying Hope, the stars were cold and still again. But the space around them was full of dark human ships, holding position, running their damage checks, moving calmly through everything that had just happened as if this were a normal morning's work. For them, Sailuru was beginning to understand. It probably was. The first human Sailuru ever saw in person was carrying a child. It was one of the medical team members who came through the docking bay first, a young woman with short dark hair and a medical kit strapped across her back. She came through the airlock, took 3 steps into the Kethari corridor, and immediately crouched down next to a small Kethari boy who was sitting alone by the wall, separated from his family in the confusion, too frightened to move or make a sound. The human woman was enormous. That was the first thing Sailuru noticed. He had read the figures. Humans were larger than Kethari on average, heavier, built along denser lines. But reading figures was different from standing in a corridor and watching a being that was nearly twice your height crouch down with surprising gentleness and speak softly to a small child who was too scared to look up. The child looked up eventually. The human showed him something in her medical kit, something that lit up, a small diagnostic light, soft blue, and the boy's skin flickered from scared red to curious yellow. The human smiled. Then she picked him up with one arm, held him easily against her side, and walked with him toward the triage area while speaking into her comm unit to locate the boy's parents. Sailuru watched this and did not move for a moment. Then the rest of the human medical team came through the airlock, and he had to move because the corridor filled up quickly, and the humans were physically large enough that standing still, while they moved around you, felt like standing in a river. They were not unkind. They were not rough or careless. but they moved through the ship with a physical confidence that was slightly overwhelming, carrying equipment that two Cathari working together would have managed, ducking under door frames that were the right height for Cathari, and about 15 centimeters too low for the taller humans, who ducked without breaking stride as if this were automatic. They spoke to each other in short sentences, used hand signals that Sayuluru couldn't read, and got to work on the wounded with a focused efficiency that didn't leave much room for hesitation. One of the human medics walked past Sayuluru, glanced at him, and said, "You the ambassador," in a tone that was direct but not rude. "Yes," Sayuluru said. "Marchetti wants to see you when you're ready. Take your time, she's doing reports." The medic moved on without waiting for a response. Sayuluru took a shuttle to the unconquered sun 2 hours later, once he was sure his crew was being looked after and his wounded were stable. The shuttle pilot was a young human man who pointed out things on the unconquered sun's exterior as they approached damage points, repaired sections, a long scoring mark along the port side from a Vreath-heavy weapon that the pilot mentioned with the same tone someone used when pointing out a scratch on a vehicle they were fond of, mildly annoyed, not distressed. The inside of the unconquered sun was not what Sayuluru expected. He had imagined something severe, all hard surfaces and weapons storage, and the general atmosphere of a place built for conflict. And those things were present. The corridors were narrow and functional. Equipment was secured behind strong panels everywhere. The walls had damage-rating markers painted on them at regular intervals so crew could assess hull integrity quickly. But there were also photographs, small personal ones, attached to the walls near crew bunks with adhesive corners, showing family members and animals and landscapes of a blue and green world. There was a common area with a table that had clearly been used for many meals, scratched, and worn in a way that spoke of years of use. There was a board near the mess hall covered in small notes and drawings, and what appeared to be a running list of who owed who money for some kind of ongoing betting game. The ship was lived in. It had the feeling of a home that happened to also be a weapon. Admiral Yeva Marchetti's briefing room was at the end of a corridor near the command center. Sayuluru was shown in by a crew member who knocked twice, opened the door, and left immediately. The room was practical. A table, several chairs built for human-sized bodies, screens on 2 walls showing status reports, and a window that looked out into the space where the captured Vreath vessels were being held under guard. Marchetti was at the far end of the table. She was shorter than several of the humans Sayuluru had seen, but she sat in a way that made her seem larger, straight-backed, solid, the posture of someone who had spent a long time being the person in the room that other people looked at when things went wrong. She had short gray-brown hair and burn scars on both forearms, old ones, faded to silver. She was holding a metal cup of something dark and hot, and she was reading through paperwork on a flat screen with the slightly tired focus of someone doing necessary work they would rather have finished already. She stood when Sayuluru entered. He was struck again by her size. He was struck also by the fact that she extended her hand toward him in a way that his briefing notes identified as a human greeting gesture, an offer to grip hands briefly, a gesture that in human culture carried meaning around trust and meeting as equals. He took her hand carefully. Her grip was firm but controlled. She was clearly making an effort to apply less pressure than she could. "Ambassador Sayuluru," she said, "sit down, please. Are you well? Were you hurt?" "I am not hurt," he said. He sat. The chair was slightly too large for him, but he managed. "Your medical team has been excellent. My people are being looked after." "Good." She sat back down and wrapped both hands around her cup. She looked at him with a steady, practical gaze that reminded him of certain kinds of experienced diplomats, people who had seen enough to be calm about most things. "Your ship will need significant repairs. We can tow you to the nearest cooperative station. It'll be about 14 hours. "That would be very appreciated," Sayuluru said. He paused. He had prepared words for this. He had composed them carefully in his head during the shuttle ride over, drawing on the formal language of the Cathari tradition he wanted to invoke. He said them now. Admiral Marchetti, my people owe your people a debt that our tradition calls Velsethara. In our language, this means soul debt, a binding of gratitude between species that is recognized in our culture as one of the most serious and permanent forms of honor. We do not invoke it lightly. It means that the Cathari people will stand with humanity whenever humanity calls on us, for as long as our species exists. Marchetti looked at him for a moment. Then she looked slightly uncomfortable in a way that seemed genuine. She set down her cup. Ambassador, she said carefully, I appreciate that truly, but you don't owe us anything. Sailyuru blinked. You saved 4,000 lives. We were already in the sector, she said. This is our patrol zone. You sent out an SOS. We answered it. She said it plainly. That's what the response division does. It's our job. You risked your fleet. You lost crew members. She was quiet for a moment. Yates and Park, she said. From the Harlow, yes. She said their names like she was holding something. That matters. I won't pretend it doesn't, but that doesn't change why we came. Sailyuru looked at her. I wish to ask you something, and I hope it is not rude. Go ahead. When the Vreeth contacted you on the channel, when they told you how many ships they had, you did not warn them. You did not tell them what your fleet was capable of. You did not tell them what would happen if they stayed. You simply counted down. Marchetti picked up her cup again. Yes. Why? She took a slow sip. Then she set the cup down and looked out the window at the captured Vreeth ships drifting in the dark. Because if they had known what we were, she said, some of them would have run before we could make sure they never do this again. The room was quiet. Sailyuru sat with that answer for a long moment. He turned it over in his mind the way he turned over complex diplomatic language, looking for the layers in it, the meaning behind the words. She had not been angry when she said it. She had not been proud of it. She said it the same way she said everything, plainly, as a fact, as the reason that made sense. Outside the window, the stars were very still, and the captured ships floated in the human fleet's shadow, and Sailyuru thought that perhaps he was beginning to understand what kind of people had answered his signal. The Galactic Cooperative Assembly Chamber was one of the largest enclosed spaces in known space. Its ceiling was so high that the upper levels were partially obscured by atmospheric haze, and the lighting at the top of the chamber was calibrated to mimic open sky for the species that found fully enclosed spaces uncomfortable. The seating tiers ran in a wide oval, each tier assigned to a different species delegation, and on busy session days, the chamber held representatives from over 240 recognized spacefaring civilizations. Today was a very busy session day. Word had traveled fast. It always did when the Vreeth were involved, because the Vreeth were large and loud, and had spent a long time being one of the most feared raider fleets on the galactic frontier. News that a Vreeth raiding party had been destroyed, not driven off, not negotiated with, but systematically dismantled by a fleet of 17 ships belonging to a species most of the assembly had never taken seriously, moved through diplomatic channels and trading posts and long-range comm relays with the speed of something that no one quite believed and everyone wanted to hear more about. The Vreeth Dominion had filed a formal complaint 3 days after the engagement. The complaint accused humanity of unprovoked military aggression, disproportionate use of force, illegal seizure of Vreeth naval vessels, and what the document described as a reckless and destabilizing pattern of unsanctioned military intervention in sovereign space. The last point made several delegates in the assembly uncomfortable, because it was the point that was hardest to simply dismiss. The Vreeth's other complaints were fairly weak, attacking a civilian vessel in distress, and then complaining about the response was a position that was difficult to defend with a straight face. But the broader question of what humanity was doing, and how far they intended to do it, was one that had been growing quietly in the back of diplomatic conversations for some time. The assembly hall was packed. Delegate species had pulled up every file on humanity they could find in the past 6 weeks. Some of what they found was expected: standard developmental species data, environmental surveys of the human homeworld, trade agreements, first contact protocols. But several delegations had done deeper research, and what the deeper research revealed had generated a very specific kind of quiet attention in the chamber. The Terran Rapid Response Division had been responding to SOS signals for 31 years. The database showed 214 recorded responses. Every single one of those responses had resulted in the rescue target surviving. Not most of them, all of them. In 31 years, the response division had never arrived too late to save the people who called. The distance some of those responses covered was not easily explainable. Several of the Assembly's tactical analysts had quietly worked through the math on the Unconquered Sun's response time to the Cathari signal, and come back with numbers that suggested either the ship had been in the sector before the signal was broadcast, or humans had developed a faster-than-light drive component that was more efficient than anything currently on record. Neither explanation was completely comfortable. The Vreeth ambassador, a tall, broad-shouldered figure named Korath Vel, stood before the assembly podium and made his case in the firm, measured tones of someone who knew the legal ground was shaky, but intended to stand on it anyway. He argued that humanity had no authority to operate a military fleet in the outer verge, which was technically ungoverned space. He argued that the response had gone beyond what was necessary to protect the Cathari vessel. He argued that humanity was establishing a pattern of military presence in frontier space that threatened the natural order of sovereignty and independent operation that all spacefaring species had a right to maintain. "The humans call this a rescue operation," Korath Vel said. "We call it an occupation force wearing a charitable mask. We call it an armed fleet that appears without warning, engages without authorization, and claims a right to intervene anywhere their signal happens to reach. Today it is the outer verge. Tomorrow it is wherever they decide is next." There was murmuring in the chamber, some of it sympathetic, some of it not. Several delegates who had their own reasons to dislike unsanctioned military activity in ungoverned space were taking careful notes. The cooperative session chair called for the responding party. Humanity's formal diplomatic representative, Undersecretary Priya Desai, had prepared a precise legal response that addressed the technical points of the Vreeth complaint one by one. It was thorough and well-argued, and would certainly be entered into the record and cited in future legal discussions. But the session chair also recognized a secondary speaker who had submitted a request 3 days earlier. Ambassador Sail Yuru of the Cathari walked to the podium. He was small, even by Cathari standards. In the enormous chamber, standing at a podium built for the average size of the Assembly's member species, he looked smaller still, a slight, soft glowing figure with pale blue skin and large quiet eyes, dressed in the formal robes of Cathari diplomatic service. He looked like exactly what he was, a civilian administrator from a peaceful species that built colony ships for families, not warships for conquest. He stood at the podium for a moment before speaking. He looked out at the hundreds of delegations, at the vast, complicated, imperfect body of galactic civilization arranged in its tiers around him, and he gathered himself, and then he spoke. "3 months ago," he said, "my people were dying. We were in a part of space where no one was required to help us. We had no military allies there. We had no treaty protections that applied to that sector. We were 4,000 civilians on a ship that could not run, and there were 42 warships closing in on us, and the only thing we could do was send a signal into the dark and hope." His voice was steady. He had spent 30 years as a diplomat. He knew how to hold a room. "We did not expect anyone to come. I will be honest about that. I sent the signal because it was the only thing left available to me, not because I believed it would work. But it worked. Something answered it. Something that was already in the sector, already there, already watching that part of space, already doing what I would later learn it had been doing for 31 years. He paused. The delegate from the Vreeth Dominion calls the Human Response Division a destabilizing force. He calls it an occupation wearing a charitable mask. He asks this assembly to consider what it means that a human fleet can appear anywhere their signal reaches and engage without formal authorization. He looked at Koreth Vel. I stood on their ship. I sat in their mess hall. I watched their crew members play cards and argue about sports and mourn their dead with the quiet, private grief of people who had lost friends they cared about. I met a young medic who carried a frightened child through a damaged ship with one arm while she worked her comm unit with the other, because the child needed to be held and she had a free arm, and that was reason enough. His skin was a steady, deep blue now, not fearful, not anxious, certain. The Vreeth call them dangerous. Perhaps they are. They are certainly powerful. They are certainly willing to go places that other species consider too risky and do things that other species consider too costly. They are built by a world that is harder than most of our worlds, and they carry that hardness with them into space. He let the chamber sit in silence for just a moment. But I have spent 30 years studying what makes a species truly dangerous, and what I know is this. The most dangerous thing in the galaxy is not a fleet with powerful weapons. It is a people who have decided that suffering is only acceptable when it happens to someone they don't care about. The humans care about people they have never met. They answer signals from species they have no relationship with, in sectors they have no legal obligation to patrol, at costs they absorb without complaint. He looked out at the full chamber. The Vreeth say that is destabilizing. I say that what they mean is that it makes it harder to hurt people without consequence. I say that what they mean is that someone has finally decided that the dark parts of space, the ungoverned sectors, the frontier zones, the places far from any protection, are not places where cruelty gets to operate undisturbed anymore. He stood straight. This assembly may vote however it chooses on the technical questions of authorization and legal jurisdiction. I am not a lawyer, but I want the record to show that one species, which most of you had never thought much about 6 weeks ago, answered a signal that no one else answered, and 4,000 of my people are alive because of it, and that is what I came here to say. He stepped back from the podium. The chamber was quiet for 3 full seconds, a long silence in a room that large, with that many species in it. Then the voting opened on the Vreeth motion for sanctions. It failed not narrowly, unanimously. Koreth Vel left the chamber without speaking to anyone. Several other delegates who had come prepared to vote for the motion quietly updated their own diplomatic files on humanity and said nothing at all. Undersecretary Desai found Sail Yuru in the corridor outside the chamber afterward and told him, in the careful language of human diplomacy, that she appreciated his words very much. Sail Yuru said he had only said what was true. She smiled, and it was a full, warm, genuine human smile, the kind that used the whole face, and she said that in her experience, that was always the hardest kind of speech to give. 14 hours away in the quiet dark of the outer verge, the unconquered sun had already answered 2 more signals. Its hull repairs were 60% complete. Its crew had eaten, slept, argued, mourned, and gone back to work. Admiral Marchetti had filed her reports, finished her paperwork, and was standing at the forward window with her coffee, watching the stars. Somewhere out there, a signal was being sent. She was already listening.